Did George Floyd kill George Floyd? Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. This is not some speculation from the right-wing media, Bill. This is actually the case that will be made in defense of the police officers who are charged related to the death of George Floyd in an incident that has sparked nationwide, frankly, global Black Lives Matter protests all over the place. And basically, even though the county medical examiner concluded that cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers was the cause of death, and a follow-up autopsy done by a Dr. Michael Baden, hired by the family, also concluded that his death was related to it. In fact, it said he died because of the way he was restrained, period. He died of asphyxiation, not cardiac arrest, in this case on the second autopsy. Although Baden concludes also, or agrees, that the officers probably didn't intend to kill him. Bill, the defense plans to make the case that George Floyd was already under the influence of an overdose quantity of fentanyl, which is an opioid, that the police officers acted appropriately in their conduct according to their training, not according to any public moral code necessarily that people would expect of police, but according to their training, that they used appropriate restraint methods, that they called for medical help more than once, and that before George Floyd ever got on the ground, he was saying that he couldn't breathe 6 times. Bill, all of this probably comes as no shock to you because a lot of people who are following this case understand the fentanyl connection, the toxicology report. But my question really is, what difference will it make in light of the fact that the whole country has gone after the idea that George Floyd was murdered?
I think there are 2 things in play here. One of them is justice, and the other one is perceived justice. I've always been and continue to be extremely sympathetic to police officers who are acting in the urgency of the moment, and so on and so on and so on. They have the worst job in the world. But when you mention this, I'm reminded of watching the defense for Rodney King, rather for the officers who were accused of beating Rodney King. And I watched the defense officers basically play the videotape back and forth and advance a couple frames. I say, you can see Mr. King, his shoulder is leaving the ground. He's attempting to regain his feet. He's still a threat to the police officer. And there's an old adage that says, if you have a good enough lawyer, he can make you believe that an elephant can hang off the edge of a cliff with his tail tied to a daisy. What happens in the course of that Rodney King trial, which I watched pretty carefully, was that the defense had made it look compelling that Rodney King was still fighting, that the police officers were acting appropriately, and so on. And they were doing this by running the film frame by frame and so on. They weren't lying. But when you run the film in real time, it becomes pretty clear it's 4 police officers wailing on a guy with a stick who's down. I know that King was driving recklessly. I have no doubt that King put up a fight. He was much bigger than the police officers. All of those things are mitigating to the degree until the suspect is incapacitated, at which point they no longer are mitigating. And it was clear that with 4 police officers, Rodney King on the ground could simply have been cuffed, and that would have been the end of it. I go to this great length to say that when I saw the footage of the George Floyd incident, I saw a police officer with his knee on the neck of this man for quite a long time. And as I recall, the man had his hands cuffed behind him, and I cannot find any justification for that whatsoever.
Well, now, Bill, let me fill that detail in, because there's also a story which our viewers can see in the American Spectator by a guy named George Barry, who was a prosecuting attorney and worked for a DA's office and was actually part of a unit that was established in Philadelphia to investigate abusive police behavior. And in the article in American Spectator, George Barry says, so who killed George Floyd? he did. And he says not only did the police follow proper procedures, and he shows slides from police training for that city that show the very position that Derek Chauvin was in, the officer in question who faces the most serious charges, that position to restrain somebody is also a position called the restoration position, or I'm sorry, the recovery position. And it is designed for use with suspects or perpetrators who are experiencing symptoms of excited delirium, speaking in kind of scattered gibberish, having a hard time staying on their feet. And so he's not just, the defense attorney here is not just arguing that these guys were doing the best they could to restrain a larger man and not get hurt. He's saying they followed Minneapolis Police Department procedure, and the position that Chauvin was in was designed to keep the airway open so that George Floyd would not die in his condition of excited delirium.
Were you shocked when you saw the video?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. The whole question here really, because we can't resolve this case. We're obviously hearing two different sides and the jury will hear all of it. But the real question is, like, will you believe the testimony, the toxicology report, the autopsy results, 37 minutes of body cam with audio, or your own lion eyes?
Well, my own lion eyes showed me a guy sitting on the neck of a guy who was saying, "I can't breathe," and gasping for air.
But he was saying, "I can't breathe" 6 times before he was on the ground. And let me add this detail, which I hadn't heard before. He asked to get on the ground. George Floyd requested repeatedly to get on the ground.
Let me just say this. I think there is a compelling case to be made in defense of the police officer if it turns out that he was doing nothing other than following instructions, that the training given to him by the police department of that city. However, there comes a point in all of this where we expect decent people, we expect Americans to understand the difference between, hey, I was just following orders, I was just acting according to procedure. Everybody who saw that video was shocked by the video. And I trust that reaction because I think people have an inherent sense of threat and an inherent sense of justice and mercy. And I understand that there was a lot of stuff going on to mitigate this. And if this is indeed what the Minneapolis Police Department trained him to do, then that certainly is mitigating. But I'll tell you something, Scott, if it had been anybody that I love, or if it had been me, and I had been on the ground saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and even if I couldn't be breathing earlier, I'm sorry. I don't see it. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one. And I know a lot of people have gone to great lengths to talk about that what a basic fundamental criminal George Floyd was. And this is all true. And to me, this mitigates everything up to the point where he is subdued. And at that point, no. And so, like I said, this is a two-part.
Go ahead. But I was going to say, even if the officer thought he was doing what he needed to do to keep a guy alive when he's in a state of excited delirium, according to his training, you're saying even then he should have overruled his training and said, "No, this can't be right. I know better than my training people"?
You're telling me that the Minneapolis Police Department says that the best way for someone who's having a problem with an airway issue is to lie face down on the cement with your head sideways and a police officer on your neck? Is that what they're saying? Is that what a paramedic would do? There's your answer, actually. Is that what a paramedic would do?
But they're not paramedics, Bill. They're police officers trained as police officers.
But you're claiming that this, look, what it sounds like to me is that the training given by the police department indicates that this is a way for a healthy person to breathe while being essentially restrained by force by a policeman.
No, this is a way for a pre-cardiac arrest person to breathe while he's being restrained by a police person, because the risk of excited delirium, especially when brought on by drugs, which it was clear the officers believed that he was under the influence. In fact, he said, George Floyd told the officers he had been hooping, which apparently is a drug term, meaning he had been doing some drugs, that this was a position designed to keep him from getting further excited and risking cardiac arrest.
Look,
this is the defense. This is not what I'm saying. This is just the defense.
No. Look, this is all, first of all, it's all news to me. But it is obviously mitigating. My question remains, at what point does the officer realize that this guy is dead? At what point does he realize this is not working, it's making things worse? I simply... And if I was playing prosecution, which I don't like to do with police officers, because as I say, it's an exceedingly difficult job. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, this particular officer had at least one pre-existing citation, and probably more, I think, for excessive use of force, did he not? I think he did. I remember, of all the things that I heard about the George Floyd incident, the fact that this officer had been previously cited for excessive use of force. I know a lot of police officers who saw that and said that's just not right. And so I cannot tell you I don't know whether or not this was a medically approved, not only a medically approved, the medically approved position to put a suspect in who's having trouble breathing. But frankly, to be perfectly honest with you, I find that a little hard to believe. If the person is not resisting arrest, the idea that you would that having a person lying with their face against the ground like this, with somebody's weight on your neck, is the very best possible way to get that person to breathe. If that's what their training manual says, then the city of Minneapolis is in for a pretty thorough investigation at the very least.
Now, George Floyd's piece, by the way, in the American Spectator argues that the amount of fentanyl in George Floyd's bloodstream in the post-mortem examination was some 11 nanograms per milliliter, and that it's possible to overdose with as little as 3 nanograms per milliliter. So Barry makes the case that Floyd was a dead man walking before he ever met the police. However, there's a Columbia University neuroscientist named Carl Hart who said that it's really difficult to measure the amount of fentanyl in a bloodstream, and especially post-mortem, because the chemicals begin to break down and it's really hard to get an accurate measure. And the range with psychotic drugs, the range over which someone may be considered in overdose status or not is not cut and dried. So there clearly is going to be an argument over that issue. But I'm wondering, all of this taken, whether you're watching the videos, whether you're reading the autopsy reports, whether you're looking at the toxicology screen, all of this, to me, seems unlikely to change the minds of any panel of 12 jurors in this country who has not yet made up their mind.
Well, the whole idea of finding jurors for this case will be people who have not heard of it, or at least know essentially very little of it, yeah. Which seems inconceivable, but it's a big country. And so it's difficult for me to talk about this without hearing the prosecution side of the case. I mean, if you lay all that stuff out, anytime you lay any case of any kind where you lay out all of the evidence on one side of the case and you haven't heard the other side of the case at all yet, will convince you about anything. Yes. It'll convince you that there were ancient astronauts. It'll convince you that the 16th Earl of Oxford wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. It'll convince you about the moon landing being fake. All of that is something that has to be factored in there. But again, and I want to come to the second part of this, which I think is more important. But to wrap up this first part, I still stand by the very strong sense that the fact that I was shocked, you were shocked, other people were shocked, police officers were shocked, there was something wrong there. There was something that just looked wrong and looked exceedingly indifferent If it turns out that all of these things are true, I think it is certainly mitigating, and then it'll be up to a jury who have heard not only the defense argument presented here, but also the prosecution argument and so on, and that'll be up to them. But on to the larger issue. These riots and this entire George Floyd incident happened with the police officer under arrest for first-degree murder. The Rodney King incident, which I'm more familiar with having lived in Los Angeles at the time, none of the police officers were later charged, but they weren't arrested at the time.
And when let me clarify at a moment here, Bill, because my understanding is the initial charge was third-degree murder on the part of Derek Chauvin, and that was third degree in essence, and I know the legal scholars watching this will laugh at this description, but basically third-degree murder is essentially risky behavior that results in unintentional death. Then after the
that was entirely my misstatement.
Yeah, after the big public outcry, the state attorney general, Minnesota State Attorney General, upgraded the charges to second degree, and that, in essence, is death caused while intentionally inflicting bodily harm. So that's my understanding of where we are with the charges.
Well, first of all, if it turns out that the Attorney General charged him with third-degree murder based on the facts of the case, and then public outcry forced him to raise the charges, that's an act of cowardice on the part of the Attorney General.
Well, and it went from district attorney, by the way, initial charges, district attorney, and then state attorney general. So it was local, and then it went statewide.
That sounds to me like railroading. But let's just cut to the chase here. First of all, if this officer is acquitted, let me be crystal clear on this, because this is the salient point about the entire show and this entire question. If this police officer is acquitted in terms of the evidence, then he needs to go free. And if the whole country burns down because of that, then that's too bad. This is the point that I wanted to make. I don't think that's the case from looking at it, but let's just deal with hypotheticals because this is still in the future.
Sure.
If it turns out, unlike the Rodney King case, if it turns out that this guy did everything exactly right and is unjustly in jail, then he needs to be freed. And that will cause an uprising that I think made the original uprising look like a warm-up. And if that means that the cities in America burn, then that's what happens, because when you get right down to it, at the end of it all, justice, individual justice, is the foundation for this society. And to lock up a policeman who, in fact, I'm not saying this is the case, but if it's proven to be the case, that this police officer is not guilty and is locked up in order to appease the mob, then everything that this country stands for is finished. And the damage that a mob can do, the damage that riots can do, the damage that unrest can do, the damage that all of it can do is nothing compared to the damage done by the United States of America essentially adopting a position where we will have political prisoners, because that's what the police officer will be if he is found to be not guilty of any of these charges. Then keeping him in prison so that the streets don't explode is making him into a political prisoner, and I won't have that. I would rather just get the rioting over with and deal with that, and than to see that happen. It certainly doesn't look like that from what I saw, but let me just say this. If he is found not guilty, if you had told me he was found not guilty prior to laying out the mitigating evidence, I would have been shocked. And everybody else will be shocked too. And this is another problem we find ourselves with in this country, and that is that because of the way that the educational system has been destroyed, there is no rational thinking. The entire emotional argument of the last 25 years, the apology tours, the confessions, the going on Oprah, the crying, all of it. We become a nation of children who deal with emotion, and we saw this with the Brett Kavanaugh case. It wasn't a question of whether or not the evidence was against Brett Kavanaugh. The evidence was who put on the most convincing cry fit. And this is the fundamental issue at the bottom of everything. But I stand by my statement about this. This whole show is about morals, philosophy, and finding some kind of a moral course through difficult, extremely narrow and difficult situations. So we're dealing with hypotheticals. If, hypothetically, he is found not guilty by a fair jury, he needs to go free. And to the degree that that can be explained why he was set free, they should do it. It's not going to matter. Because on top of the tragedy of George Floyd, which is a tragedy one way or another, you can say he was full of drugs, you can say he was a dead man walking. What happened there was perceived to be an example of something that happens all the time. And the reason that it was what it was is because it was captured on video. We have to understand that there is still a police brutality problem, and if this officer had prior, as is my understanding, prior citations for excessive use of force, that is the problem right there. Is bad cops is the problem, and in the case of this one, it may be just bad training as well. But I want to be crystal clear on this. I don't know both sides of the argument, so I'm not in any position to say, yes, he's guilty, no, he's not, he needs to be released. I don't have both sides of the evidence, and I certainly don't have weeks and weeks to mull it over. But I can say, in terms of hypothetical outcomes, that if he is, in fact, found to be guilty of overstepping his authority, he needs to go to jail. And if it turns out that he is found not guilty, he needs to be set free, and damn the consequences, because the consequences cannot be worse. They can be certainly more explosive, they can be more visual, and they can be more violent in the short term, but the consequences cannot be worse than to have an innocent person locked up for the public relations value of it.
And we will continue to follow this case, obviously, both here on Bill Whittle Now as well as our other program, Right Angle with Stephen Green, as events warrant and as the situation develops. And in case I didn't say so, I want to qualify two things. Number one is that the case of the defense is that in addition to the fentanyl, George Floyd had pre-existing cardiovascular issues, which complicated that and contributed to that, what George Barry called dead man walking phenomenon. And then finally, that the defense doesn't have to prove that Officer Chauvin, for example, behaved in all manner as a moral agent acting appropriately. They only have to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of the members of the jury, or at least a majority of the members of the jury, because he has to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And so his job is to introduce reasonable doubt. During this program, as time goes on, you will find that new facts on the ground will shape the discussion here, because among the other qualities that we have as conservatives is the realization that facts are troublesome things. They stick around, and we like to grapple with them. We like to have these conversations, and we can only do so because of the members at BillWhittle.com who fund this entire enterprise and make it possible.
Scott, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead,
I just have to, when you were summing it up, I just had to add one thing, because all of these hypotheticals come down to basically thought experiments. As far as the dead man walking argument goes, if he was so full of this drug, fentanyl, that he was basically had 2 minutes left to live, and if he had resisted arrest, and if the police officer had bashed his skull in, and while he was down on the ground, kicked him in the face and continued to bash his skull in, would that suddenly be okay because he was a dead man walking?
And that's the case of the prosecution. The prosecution may merely need to prove that both facts can be true, that in effect he was a dead man walking full of fentanyl and pre-existing cardiovascular conditions, as well as the fact that he was murdered by a police officer.
My point is, if he had 2 minutes left to live and a police officer beats him to death in the face with a stick, which is not what happened, that beating and that murder is not justified by the fact that the guy had 2 minutes left to live.
Correct.
Because nobody really knew that.
That's what I'm just saying. That's the case.
That's all I wanted to say.
That's the case the prosecution is making. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching this. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that notification bell as well as the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss a single episode of those that are available to non-members. However, you'll get even more and access to the content produced by our members if you go to BillWhittle.com and click the big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.